It all started on one of those warm, lazy afternoons when you can practically feel the neighborhood watching itself. My wife and I had just moved into this supposedly peaceful community, clean lawns, identical mailboxes, and people who smiled a little too wide when they told you about the rules. You know, the kind of place where a single weed growing between the driveway cracks could start a full-blown neighborhood scandal. At first, everything seemed fine. We kept our yard tidy, paid our dues, and even attended the mandatory community welcome meeting. That's where I met her, Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of all HOA laws, spoken and unspoken. She wasn't technically on the HOA board, but everyone knew she ran things anyway. If a sign was an inch too tall or a trash can was visible for more than 5 minutes after pickup, Karen would appear, clipboard in hand, phone camera ready. The first encounter with her was, well, awkward. I was collecting my mail one morning, and she marched up like she owned the place. "Excuse me," she said sharply, pointing at my mailbox. "That's not the approved paint shade. HOA guidelines specify suburban cloud, not winter white. You'll need to fix that." I blinked, trying not to laugh. The colors were identical to the naked eye. "I'm pretty sure it's the same one," I replied politely. Her smile was tight. "I'll bring a swatch next time. We can compare." And she did. The very next morning, she was back, holding up a color sample, squinting like she was trying to solve a crime. That was my first clue that peace and quiet weren't part of the HOA deal. Weeks went by, and I started noticing Karen's daily walks. They always seemed to include stopping by our front yard, leaning just a bit too far over the property line, and scribbling notes on her clipboard. My wife and I joked about it at first, called her neighborhood security. But then things got weirder. It began with the mailbox. One day I found the door slightly open. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the mail carrier forgot to close it. But then it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes the mail inside would be disheveled, sometimes missing entirely. Bills showed up late. My wife's magazine subscription stopped coming. I decided to check our security footage. And there she was, Karen, marching up the driveway like she had every right in the world, opening our mailbox, flipping through the contents, and closing it again. I couldn't believe it. Who just goes through someone else's mail? I wanted to confront her right away, but my wife stopped me. "Let's not start a war," she said. "We'll talk to the post office instead." So I did. The postmaster wasn't happy. He told me that tampering with someone's mail is a federal offense, and if it continued, we should report it immediately. I thought that warning would scare her off, but I underestimated how far Karen's authority complex would go. The next week, I caught her again. This time, she wasn't just looking. She was holding one of our envelopes and taking photos. I stormed outside. "Karen, what are you doing?" "That's my mail," I yelled. She jumped but recovered quickly. "Oh, calm down. I was just making sure your mailbox isn't being used for unapproved materials. HOA regulations clearly state there's no HOA rule about personal mail," I snapped. "That's illegal, Karen." She folded her arms, defiant as ever. "If you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't mind me checking. We've had issues with people receiving unpermitted flyers before." That's when I realized she genuinely believed she had the right. The next few days were tense. She stopped pretending to be subtle. She'd walk right up to our mailbox in broad daylight, even wave at my security camera. It was like she was daring me to do something. I tried reporting it to the HO, but of course, the board was full of her friends. "Karen's just being thorough," one of them told me over email. "She has our community's best interests at heart." That's when I decided enough was enough. If no one was going to stop her, I would. At first, I thought about installing a lock or a camera inside the mailbox, but that felt too simple. I wanted something that would make her think twice before touching anything on my property again, something she'd remember. Then, while I was visiting my brother's farm that weekend, inspiration struck. He's a beekeeper, and I helped him move a few hives that day. Watching those bees swarm around, buzzing in unison, gave me an idea so ridiculous it might just work. What if I filled the mailbox with bees? Not a whole hive, of course, that'd be dangerous, but just enough to make her regret ever opening that box again. I spent a couple of days planning. I ordered a small observation hive setup and a few dozen bees, harmless ones that my brother assured me wouldn't sting unless provoked. I made sure the hive was temporary and safe, and I could relocate the bees easily afterward. Once everything was ready, I waited until late evening when no one was around. I carefully placed the small bee box inside the mailbox, leaving just enough space for air to flow. From the outside, it looked completely normal. The stage was set. Now it was just a matter of time before Karen's nosy instincts got the better of her again. The next morning, I positioned myself by the window with my coffee, pretending to read the paper while my security feed played on the tablet beside me. Around 8:15 a.m., right on schedule, there she was, Karen, in her neon tracksuit, clipboard in one hand, fake concern in her voice as she muttered to herself while approaching our property. She looked around like a cartoon villain trying to make sure no one was watching. But I was watching. Oh, I was watching. Karen reached for the mailbox, hesitated for a split second, and then yanked the door open. And that's when the buzzing began. The sudden, loud, frantic sound made her jump back instantly. A few bees flew out, swirling around her head like tiny guardians of justice. She shrieked and flailed her arms wildly, stumbling backward onto the curb. Her clipboard went flying into the air as she screamed, "Bees? Bees! Help!" I couldn't help it. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. It wasn't malicious laughter, more like the release of weeks of pent-up frustration. Karen ran down the street, waving her arms like she was being chased by a swarm the size of a hurricane. But only a few bees had followed her. They weren't aggressive, just confused. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. It was the HOA group chat lighting up. Karen had already posted about a dangerous infestation in the neighborhood and demanded an emergency meeting to discuss bee safety regulations. I just smiled and sipped my coffee. Little did she know, the bees were perfectly safe and temporary. My brother came later that afternoon to collect them. But by then, the story had spread through the entire community. For the first time since moving in, people were laughing at Karen, not with her. And that was only the beginning. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood was buzzing, pun fully intended. Everyone had heard about the Great Bee incident, and Karen was doing everything she could to spin the story in her favor. She went door to door warning people about a potentially hazardous swarm, supposedly threatening the community's safety. She even handed out printed flyers, claiming that my negligence had invited a dangerous pest infestation. I watched her from my window, shaking my head. She couldn't stand being embarrassed, so she had to twist the narrative. The problem was, nobody seemed to be taking her seriously anymore. When she stopped by old Mr. Benson's porch, I could see him laughing so hard he had to steady himself on his cane. Mrs. Patel, who usually stayed out of HOA drama, simply closed her door mid-conversation. Even the kids riding their bikes down the street were buzzing, "BZZZZ Karen," under their breath. Later that afternoon, I went outside to get the mail. Yes, the actual mail this time, no bees included. Karen spotted me and immediately stormed over. Her face was blotchy, and she was wearing a sun hat like she thought another swarm might attack at any second. "Do you realize," she snapped, "that you could be fined for endangering the community? Those bees could have stung someone." I crossed my arms, trying to hide my smirk. "Karen, I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't put any bees anywhere. Maybe nature just decided to teach you a lesson about boundaries." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "Don't play dumb. I know you set me up." "Set you up? You mean, after you trespassed on federal property? Because last I checked, a mailbox is protected by law. Want me to call the post office and see what they think?" Her confidence faltered for a second, but she quickly tried to regain control. "You're twisting things. I was performing my community duty. You're not above the rules." I took a step closer and lowered my voice. "And you're not the law, Karen. You can't keep touching people's mailboxes. If you come near mine again, I will report you." For a moment, her expression hardened like stone. Then she muttered something under her breath and stomped away, her shoes clicking against the pavement like an angry metronome. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully. If anything, the embarrassment only fueled her obsession. The following week, strange things started happening. My trash can mysteriously disappeared one morning, found later at the end of the street. Notices appeared on my door claiming that my landscaping was out of compliance, even though I'd just mowed the lawn the day before. Someone even took photos of my backyard through the fence and emailed them to the board. It didn't take a detective to figure out who was behind it. One evening, while I was watering the plants, I caught her again, this time crouched near the side of my house, trying to photograph the property line marker. "Karen!" I shouted. "Why are you sneaking around my yard again?" She jumped and spun around, caught like a raccoon in a flashlight beam. "I was verifying your property measurements for HOA compliance," she stammered. I laughed in disbelief. "You're unbelievable. You don't even work for the HOA officially." "Well, someone has to keep this community in order," she said, straightening her posture like she was auditioning for sheriff of suburbia. I set down the hose and folded my arms. "You already got stung once. Metaphorically, anyway. You really want round two?" Her face reddened. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming away again. When my wife came outside, I filled her in. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "She's like a mosquito that won't quit. Maybe you should just let the postmaster handle it." I nodded. That night, I filed an official complaint with the Postal Service and sent over the security footage I'd saved. They promised to look into it. But the next morning, before I even had my coffee, I heard the sound of raised voices coming from the street. Curious, I peeked out, and there was Karen arguing with the mail carrier. "You have to check that box before you deliver anything," she was yelling. There could still be bees. The poor mailman looked bewildered. "Man, the bees are gone. I've inspected it myself. There's no issue here." "I don't believe you," she snapped. "You're just covering for him." She pointed toward my house. That was the last straw. I opened the door and walked out. "Karen, stop harassing the mailman. You've already caused enough trouble." She spun toward me, her voice rising an octave. "You can't talk to me like that. I have the right to protect this neighborhood." The mailman cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you keep interfering with mail delivery, I'll have to report you. It's a federal matter." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then she turned and stomped off, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors. The mailman looked at me, shaking his head. "You've got quite a character here. Don't worry, we'll handle her." That gave me some relief. Maybe now she'd finally back off. But instead, Karen decided to escalate things even further. 2 nights later, just after 11 p.m., I caught movement on my security feed again. Someone was at the mailbox, flashlight in hand. It was her. Again. I couldn't believe it. She was still at it, after everything that had happened. I turned to my wife, who was half asleep. "She's out there again," I whispered. She groaned. "Please tell me you're joking." "Nope." I grabbed my phone and started recording the live feed. Karen was kneeling beside the mailbox, trying to open the door slowly, like she thought she was in a spy movie. When it stuck a little, she whispered something angrily to herself and tugged harder. Then she froze. I had added a harmless motion-activated light inside the mailbox, a bright LED that flared up the second it was opened. Karen screamed so loud I could hear it through the closed windows. She dropped her flashlight, tripped over the curb, and ran off down the street yelling, "He's booby-trapped it again." By the time I stepped outside, she was gone. The street was silent, except for the faint hum of crickets. I couldn't help but laugh again. This was getting ridiculous, but at least now I had even more video evidence. The next morning, I sent everything, every clip, every photo, every incident log, to both the HOA and the postal authorities. Within a few days, I got a response from the post office. They'd contacted her officially, warning that any further tampering would result in federal charges. That should have been enough to end it. But Karen wasn't one to accept blame quietly. She retaliated by calling an emergency HOA meeting at her house. Flyers went out to every mailbox, accusing me of creating hazards and threatening the neighborhood ecosystem. Of course, curiosity got the better of me, and I showed up. When I arrived, her living room was full of homeowners, all sitting awkwardly as Karen stood at the front with a slideshow presentation titled Operation Bee Watch. She clicked to the first slide, a blurry screenshot of the bee incident. This, she began dramatically, is what happens when residents take matters into their own hands instead of following HOA procedure. Someone in the back snorted. Weren't you the one who opened his mailbox without permission? Karen shot him a glare. That's irrelevant. I raised my hand. Actually, that's very relevant. You trespassed on federal property. I didn't break any rules. A murmur rippled through the room. Even her usual supporters were shifting uncomfortably. Karen's voice started to shake. I was only doing what's best for everyone. I smiled. And how's that working out for you? The room went silent for a moment. Then, one of the HOA board members cleared his throat. Karen, perhaps it's best we let the authorities handle this matter. It's clearly gotten out of hand. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. Karen's power over the neighborhood was crumbling. Her reputation, the one she'd built on fear and fake authority, was collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. And I didn't even have to lift another finger. After that chaotic Operation Bee Watch meeting, things in the neighborhood felt different. For the first time, people weren't avoiding me. They were actually friendly. When I walked my dog or took out the trash, neighbors waved or stopped to chat, almost as if the entire community had quietly agreed that they'd had enough of Karen's dictatorship. But Karen? She was a storm cloud that refused to drift away. Over the next week, she became a ghostly presence, lurking near corners, whispering to whoever would still listen, taking photos of random driveways like she was gathering evidence for a case that only existed in her head. Sometimes, I'd see her peeking out from behind her curtains, glaring at my house as if she could stare me into submission. It would have been funny if it weren't so creepy. Then came the Saturday morning when everything escalated once again. I was out front trimming the hedge when a white sedan rolled up. No logos this time, just a government plate. Out stepped two men in postal inspection uniforms. "Morning, sir," one of them said politely. "Are you the homeowner here?" "Yes," I said, setting down the shears. "What's this about?" The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We've had multiple reports of mail tampering in this area. One of your neighbors seems to believe there's ongoing interference." I didn't need to ask who. "Let me guess," I said. "Her name starts with a K?" Both officers chuckled. "We can't confirm the complainant's name, sir," the first one said carefully, "but I think you know." I sighed and invited them to look at the footage for themselves. We went inside, and I showed them the videos. Karen opening the mailbox, taking photos, running from the bees, and even her midnight flashlight stunt. They watched in silence until the last clip ended. Then one of them shook his head and said, "Well, that settles that. She's been warned before. Seems she didn't take it seriously." "So what happens now?" I asked. "We'll handle it," he said. "You won't have to deal with her mailbox nonsense again." When they left, I finally felt a bit of relief. Maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe she'd finally stop treating my property like her personal investigation site. But Karen's pride couldn't let her back down, not after being humiliated so many times. That afternoon, she showed up at my doorstep. No clipboard, no fake friendliness, just pure fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. I kept my tone calm. "Karen, I didn't win anything. I just want you to leave my property alone." She jabbed her finger toward me. "You've embarrassed me in front of the entire neighborhood. They're laughing at me because of you." "I didn't make you open my mailbox," I said evenly. "You did that all by yourself." Her face twisted in rage. "You're toxic to this community. I'll have you removed from the HOA." I almost laughed. "You can't even remove me from a book club, Karen. I pay my dues. I follow the rules. Maybe it's time you try doing the same." She stood there, trembling with anger, before finally shouting, "This isn't over," and storming off down the driveway. My wife peeked through the doorway behind me. "She's losing it," she whispered. "Yeah," I said quietly. "But something tells me she's not done yet." And I was right. The next morning, I found my mailbox open again. But this time, it wasn't Karen who'd done it. A bright orange notice was taped to the side, "Mail service suspended pending inspection." Apparently, she had gone to the post office and filed a complaint claiming my mailbox was unsafe and infested. She even attached a photo from the bee incident as proof. I called the postmaster right away. Thankfully, he already knew the story. She's been in here 3 times this week, he said, clearly exhausted. We told her to stop, but she won't listen. Don't worry, we'll reinstate your service. We just need to send someone out to verify there's no issue. The next day, a postal worker came out, took one look at the mailbox, and shook his head. Looks fine to me. Cleanest box in the whole subdivision. He reinstated our mail delivery immediately. But Karen's reputation was officially in shambles. Word spread fast that she had been reported to federal authorities for tampering, and once the postal inspectors paid her a visit, she went completely silent for a few days. That silence didn't last long. 3 nights later, she decided to hold another neighborhood patrol. Except this time it wasn't about bees, it was about safety lights. She claimed some houses were violating HOA brightness codes and took it upon herself to measure light levels with a handheld meter she bought online. When she reached my driveway, I walked outside. Looking for something else to get you in trouble, Karen? She glared at me, eyes narrowing. Your motion light is above the lumens allowed in Section 8, Article 3. I smirked. Funny, I read that rule. It applies only to front-facing floodlights, not side-mounted sensors. You really should review your bylaws before trying to enforce them. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. She just turned around and stomped off into the dark, muttering under her breath. The next morning, though, I got an unexpected surprise. Sitting on my porch was a small cardboard box with no return address. Inside was a jar of honey and a note that read, "From one beekeeper to another. Thanks for putting Karen in her place." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the jar. Word had clearly gotten around that the bee stunt wasn't an accident. From that point on, the neighborhood slowly started to change. People who used to stay quiet began standing up for themselves. Someone else painted their mailbox a different shade just to see what would happen. Nothing did. Karen had lost her bite. But like a storm fading on the horizon, she wasn't gone completely. One afternoon, I was working on the front yard when she came walking by. No clipboard this time. No phone. Just her, walking slowly, head down. She stopped at the edge of my driveway. I was ready for another confrontation, but instead, she sighed. You humiliated me, you know that? I raised an eyebrow. You kind of did that to yourself. She didn't argue. Maybe. I just wanted things to be perfect here. Though I was supposed to keep order. People used to respect me for it. Respect and fear aren't the same thing, I said gently. She didn't respond for a moment, then nodded slightly. Guess I forgot that. She turned to leave but paused. You really didn't mean to hurt me with those bees, did you? I chuckled softly. No, Karen. I just wanted you to stop touching my mail. For the first time, she smiled, an actual human smile. Well, message received. Then she walked away, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the war was finally over. Or so I thought. A few peaceful weeks passed after that strange truce. The air around the neighborhood felt lighter, like everyone was finally exhaling after months of tension. For once, no one was whispering about HOA citations, no random photos were being taken, and even Karen seemed to mind her own business. It was blissful. I'd sit on my porch in the mornings, sipping coffee while the mail carrier waved from the street. My wife joked that I should get a "Beware of Bees" sign for the mailbox as a souvenir of our victory. The incident had become a bit of a local legend. Neighbors still brought it up now and then, usually with laughter. But I knew Karen. She might have been quiet, but she wasn't the type to forgive easily. One Saturday, I was trimming the lawn when I noticed something odd. A brand new, gleaming mailbox had been installed across the street, Karen's house. It looked familiar. Same model, same paint, same little brass flag on the side. Except hers had a shiny gold plate that read, HOA President. She wasn't president. She wasn't even on the board anymore. I called out across the road, half joking, "Trying out a new title, Karen?" She looked up from where she was planting flowers and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Just thought I'd make it official." Something about that grin told me she wasn't done playing games. Sure enough, 2 days later, another HOA notice appeared on my door, this time accusing me of creating a hostile environment and mocking HOA authority. It was written in her handwriting but had no board signatures. She was making up rules again. I didn't even bother getting mad this time. I just took a photo of the notice and sent it straight to the HOA office and the postal inspector's email thread. A few days later, an official HOA-wide message went out clarifying that only elected board members may issue community notices, and that unauthorized documentation will result in disciplinary review. In other words, they were calling her out directly. When I passed her on the street later that week, she wouldn't even look at me. Her once constant clipboard was gone, replaced by a small tote bag. She looked deflated. It was the end of an era. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little sympathy. She'd built her whole identity around control, and now that she'd lost it, she didn't seem to know who she was anymore. But peace, real peace, finally settled over the neighborhood. Until one bright afternoon in early spring. I was outside repainting the porch railing when I heard the unmistakable sound of a scream. It came from across the street. I looked up to see Karen sprinting out of her yard, waving her arms wildly, shouting, "Bees, they're back." I dropped the paintbrush and ran over, half concerned, half dreading what I'd find. Her mailbox was swarming with bees. A real hive this time. Somehow, a small colony had decided to move in naturally. They were clustered under the lid and spilling out through the flag slot. She was pacing in circles, yelling, "They followed me. They followed me from his yard." I tried not to laugh. I really did. "Karen," I said gently, "I had nothing to do with this. Looks like nature just chose your mailbox this time." Her eyes were wide. "You did this. You cursed me with bees." I raised both hands, trying to stay calm. "I swear I didn't. Call pest control. They'll relocate the hive safely." The irony was too perfect. The woman who had once invaded my mailbox, who'd started a neighborhood crusade about bees, now had her very own natural hive. Within an hour, a pest control truck arrived. The worker took one look and started chuckling. "Ma'am," he said, "these are honeybees. They're harmless. You actually want to keep them. They're good for your garden." Karen looked horrified. "Keep them? Are you insane?" He shrugged. "Up to you. But they're federally protected. You can't just spray them." I stood a few feet away, biting my lip to keep from laughing out loud. After they safely relocated the bees, the pest control guy came over to me and said quietly, "Funny thing, she told me you were the bee man. Said you summoned them." I chuckled. Guess the bees know who the real intruder was. He grinned and left, and I couldn't help but think that karma has a very specific sense of humor. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, my wife joined me on the porch. "So," she said with a smirk, "the bees came back for round 2? "Apparently," I said laughing. "But this time, they chose the right mailbox." We sat there watching the street grow quiet again. For the first time since we'd moved in, it felt like the neighborhood had finally found balance. People smiled when they passed by. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without fear of Karen rules. Even the HOA seemed calmer now that its self-appointed queen bee had lost her sting. A few days later, I saw Karen again, walking slower than usual, wearing gardening gloves and a floppy hat. She looked up as I waved. Surprisingly, she waved back. "Peace?" I asked. She sighed and nodded. "Peace. But for the record," she added, a faint smile playing on her lips, "I still don't like bees." "Yeah," I said, grinning. "I think they got that message loud and clear." After that, she mostly kept to herself. Occasionally, she'd show up at HOA meetings, quietly sitting in the back instead of leading them. And the few times she did speak, it was about practical things: community gardens, recycling, safety patrols. It was as if she'd been stung by humility and maybe learned something from it. Months passed. The mailbox drama became a funny story we'd tell at cookouts and parties. Every time someone new moved into the neighborhood, someone would eventually point to my house and say, "That's the bee guy. Ask him about Karen." I didn't mind the reputation. If anything, it was a reminder that sometimes the universe has a way of defending you, buzzing wings and all. But the best part came one morning when I went to get the mail and noticed a small jar sitting on top of my mailbox. It was filled with golden honey and had a little handwritten note tied to it. "Thanks for teaching me boundaries." "'Kay." I stood there for a long time, staring at the jar, smiling to myself. Maybe the bees hadn't just scared her, they'd changed her. When my wife came out and saw me holding the honey, she grinned. Guess she finally sweetened up. I laughed. Yeah. Took a swarm to do it, but hey, better late than never. As the sun warmed the street and the hum of the neighborhood returned to its easy rhythm, I couldn't help but think back to that first day when Karen tried to tell me what shade of white my mailbox should be. Now, it didn't matter what color it was. It stood proudly at the end of the driveway, a symbol of patience, karma, and one perfectly timed sting of poetic justice. Because sometimes, the best revenge doesn't come from anger or shouting. Sometimes it comes from a quiet buzz and a well-placed hive.